Our speaker this morning is Viki Barie. Viki has been a member of JASNA for 39 years. She has served as regional coordinator in St. Louis and Sacramento, JASNA membership chair, and has held many other offices, local and regional offices. Viki has taught classes on Jane Austen at the University of California Irvine Extension Program, as well as at various local and regional JASNA groups. She has been an Orange County Reading Group member for 28 years. Professionally, Viki is a fundraiser at Providence St. Joseph Hospital Foundation in Orange, with over 30 years experience in major and principal giving, annual giving, special events, grant writing, volunteer development, and nonprofit management. Viki earned her BA in English and a BS in geology from Washington State University at Pullman, Washington. It is my pleasure to introduce Viki Berry, presenting Jane Austen, An Ordinary and Extraordinary Life. Go ahead, Viki, and unmute yourself.
Hello. All right. Let's see if I can get can you see my screen?
Not yet.
All right. Bear with me. What now?
I see the whole screen.
All right. All right. How's that?
Very good.
All right. First of all, thanks for having me today. I want to talk about Jane Austen. She had a perfectly ordinary life, but she created some extraordinary things. So what was that nature and nurture that brought that to pass? She was born in 1775 and she died in 1817, living the 41 years in southern England, mostly in the county of Hampshire. She was the younger daughter of a country parson and his wife. She was the seventh of 8 children. She was minimally educated and lived with her parents and her sister all her life. Jane was a spinster aunt to dozens of nephews and nieces, and she lived her life as a household helper, childminder, sick nurse, and fine needlewoman. She wrote novels, letters, and short pieces of childhood entertainments. She died of a disease easily cured now and somehow received a significant burial in Winchester Cathedral. What combination of nature and nurture made Jane Austen who she was and helped create a major canon of English literature, to say nothing of the personality cult and multimedia industry we know today. I want to talk a little bit about the world that Jane Austen was born into. One of the things that's really interesting is the birth of the modern. In particular, things were changing quite dramatically in Jane Austen's time. And I want to kind of highlight that as well. She was born, obviously, right around the time the United States was born, which is always interesting for us here at JASNA. The old verities were being questioned or discarded or overrun by the new. Upheaval and change were everywhere. The world was shrinking. Conflict would span the globe, and commerce reached even the remotest shores. Science and technology were rapidly expanding, with rich stores of knowledge being created, and great men were doing great things. On the local level, Admiral and Mrs. Croft can afford to rent Kellynch Hall, when Sir Walter Elliot must downsize to a more economical lifestyle. In 7 years, Captain Wentworth goes from being a modest marital value to a very attractive matrimonial prize. Mr. Woodhouse enjoys wealth and a lovely home, but no profession, estate, or aristocratic background. The Bingleys are affluent and mobile, but with no ancestral home. Is there a whiff of the shop around all that new money? Penniless charity case Fanny Price embodies the moral gravitas so sadly lacking in Tom Bertram and the privileged Bertram's daughters. Mr. and Mrs. Edmund Bertram signal that new moral ascendancy. I want to talk a little bit about the only king that Jane Austen knew, King George III. We know him in the United States as the king who lost the colonies, but he reigned for an astonishingly long time. And one of the things that's interesting about him is the Regency period was when he was deemed unfit to rule, and that only lasted from 1790 to 1820. But many people think of Jane Austen only in the Regency period, and that's not quite true. In 1761, George III married Princess Charlotte. They had 15 children, 8 legitimate grandchildren, including Princess Charlotte, born in 1796, and Queen Victoria, born in 1819, and at least 56 known illegitimate grandchildren. The royal dukes were notorious and corrupt, and the Prince of Wales, later regent, was the worst of the lot. Many common people, including Jane Austen, reviled the princes for their excesses and moral turpitude. The princesses were cloistered at home, and most never married. Jane Austen died in July 1817, and Princess Charlotte died in childbirth in November 1817, which set off the great marriage and baby sweepstakes to provide a legitimate heir to the throne. At her birth, Victoria was the heiress presumptive. Just to give you a context for that, the entire world was caught up in war, political machinations, all kinds of things going on. This is just a list of the named wars that Britain was involved in during the period of Jane Austen's life. There's lots going on. Most of us tend to think of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, but there was also a lot going on. For instance, Wellington received most of his professional fighting experience in India before he went to Spain and Portugal and France. So there's a lot going on in the world, and most people don't realize it, but actually Jane Austen lived in a very unsettled time. One of the things that most people tend to forget is that the empire was forming during Jane Austen's lifetime. It was not yet formed. So the British Army and Navy were instrumental in helping to build the empire around the globe, both commercial and political. The British commercial interest in slavery was critical to promoting trade with the Americas, generating tremendous wealth due to slave trading and importing commodities such as sugar, tea, rice, and cotton. This was in spite of the fact that slavery on English soil was unsupported in English law, confirmed in Somerset's case in 1772, but it remained legal in most of the British Empire until the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833. As you no doubt recall, Mrs. Augusta Elton, nee Hawkins, of Bristol, with her 10,000 pounds, is eager to remind everyone of her family's wealth, but never mentions its origins, heavily dependent on slavery and trade. Bristol was the leading port dealing in the slave trade during all of Jane Austen's lifetime. So Mrs. Elton's money is definitely tainted. These commercial interests relied on the Navy to protect shipping, as well as the British East India Company and the British Army to control political power across the Asian continent and also in other places like the Caribbean. So some of you may know that the abolition movement in England had a very long history, and there was a lot of religious impetus to the abolitionist movement. So I want to just briefly touch on what the world was changing into. So the history of cotton and textiles is a kind of a shorthand for the era's exponential growth in global trade and commerce, technology, and moral and social questions about human worth. In the 18th century, India was the world leader in raw cotton production and cotton textile manufacturing, the famous Dhaka muslin that we'll be hearing about in a month or two. However, in 1774, the British Calico Act was repealed and allowed British manufacturers to compete with Eastern fabrics. As a result, cotton textile manufacturing rapidly shifted to the higher efficiency British mills and replaced the native Indian industry. Raw cotton was still being imported from India, but increasingly from the United States, Brazil, and the Caribbean, where cotton was profitable only because slave labor produced it. The new inventions of the 1770s, such as the spinning jenny, the water frame, and the spinning mule, made the British Midlands into a very profitable manufacturing center. Cotton's versatility allowed it to become popular and affordable. It was cheaper than silk and could be imprinted more easily than wool. This cheap printed cotton became the standard fashion for clothing and was accessible to the general public. 1804 was the time of William Blake's dark satanic mills, and those mills were spinning and weaving cotton. Women and children as young as 4 years old were the primary labor force for these mills because they were so much cheaper than men. 18-hour workdays were normal. Wretched housing in factory dormitories bred disease and distress, and mass movement from rural areas to mills and cities helped break down the social fabric of families and communities. So on this slide, I'm just showing that over the span of Jane Austen's lifetime, cotton and slavery go hand in hand with tremendous wealth generation for those who controlled the trade. So you can see that at Jane Austen's birth, the slave population in the colonies about 500,000. At her death, there's over 1 million slaves. The finished cotton goods exported from the UK go up to over 5.4 million pounds. And that basically wiped out all cotton production in places like India and the United States, which had very tiny textile industries. All of you know this quote, but I like it. So, do you understand muslins, sir? Asked Mrs. Allen. And so says Henry Tilney. Particularly well. I always buy my own cravats and am allowed to be an excellent judge, and my sister has often trusted me in the choice of a gown. I bought one for her the other day, and it was pronounced to be a prodigious bargain by every lady who saw it. I gave but 5 shillings a yard for it, and a true Indian muslin. Mrs. Allen was quite struck by his genius. Men commonly take so little notice of those things, said she. I can never get Mr. Allen to know one of my gowns from another. You must be a great comfort to your sister, sir. It's one of my favorites. One of the key points about life and culture in Jane Austen's time is things are expensive. Human life is cheap. Jane Austen's first interest into Bath was facilitated by a visit to her maternal uncle and his wife, James and Jane Lee Perrot. They were wealthy and childless and interested in their Austen nephews and nieces. Mrs. Austen's first son, James, was their heir presumptive and received a small income from them during his life. James's eldest son, James Edward Austen Lee, who wrote the memoir of Jane Austen, inherited their wealth and estates upon Mrs. Lee Perrot's death in 1836. Surely young Catherine Moorland's visit to Bath was based on Jane Austen's own visit to Bath in 1797. In 1799, Mrs. Lee Perrot had stopped in at a linen draper's to purchase a length of black lace. Upon leaving, she was accosted by the owner of the shop, who asked to inspect her package. At that point, it was discovered that a card of white lace worth 20 shillings, £1, was also included in the packet. Mrs. Lee Perrot insisted that it was a mistake by a clerk who had accidentally wrapped the white lace along with the black. The owner called it shoplifting. Mrs. Lee Perrot forcefully denied the claim and continued home. The plan of the shop is shown on the screen, taken from the published account of Mrs. Lee Perrot's trial. There's a picture of some lace on the right-hand side. A few days later, Mrs. Lee Perrot was arrested for theft and held for an additional 8 months in jail until the March Assizes could be held. Due to her station as a gentlewoman, she was not lodged in the public jail, but instead lived with the jailer and his wife, though in relative filth while awaiting trial. Her ever-devoted husband stayed by her side, regardless of the, quote, vulgarity, dirt, noise from morning till night, end quote. No doubt Jane Austen was relieved when her aunt turned down Mrs. Austen's offer of allowing her teenage daughters to travel to the Winchester jail to keep Mrs. Lee Perrot company. It was not unusual for family members to stay with the accused in jail. The crime which Mrs. Lee Perrot was charged with was no small thing. Under the law, nicknamed the Bloody Code, theft of any item worth 5 shillings or more was punishable by hanging, or more likely in her case, deportation to Australia for 14 years. Mrs. Lee Perrot's trial took place on March 29th, 1800. Fortunately for the family, the jury took only a few minutes to return with a not guilty verdict, and the matter was soon hushed up. In the trial of Jane's aunt, Albert Borowitz argues a careful examination of what happened at the trial suggests that the woman was probably guilty and that the jury came in with a not guilty verdict because 1, she was a wealthy gentleman's wife, and 2, the punishment for the crime was so severe. And there are other folks who weigh in on Mrs. Lee Perrot's trial and her kleptomania. But one of the challenges is there are over 220 crimes punishable by death. And it could be anything from, murder, treason, theft, all kinds of things. So it was a very different world than our own. In 1794, Jane Austen's father gave her this portable writing box, surely indicative of his encouragement and support for his budding young writer. When open, it provides a slope on which to rest paper while writing. Its various compartments include a space for an ink pot and a lockable drawer for paper and valuables. When Jane died, the desk was inherited by her sister Cassandra. It was later passed down through her eldest brother James's family and James Edward Austen Lee. In 1999, Joan Austen Lee, and many of you may remember Joan, Jane Austen's great great niece and co-founder of JASNA, entrusted it to the British Library. Among the items that had been stored for generations in the desk drawer were 3 pairs of spectacles, which according to family tradition, all belonged to Jane Austen. As Jan Fergus states, from the beginning of her career as a writer, Jane Austen wrote to and for family and friends. She always had an audience in mind, an intimate one composed of like-minded members of her own social group, members of the professional classes and the gentry. What she could not and would not do was to follow others' suggestions for her plots, characters, and actions. Even the Prince Regent's librarian could not persuade her to follow his plan of a novel. Steventon. I know many of you have been there, but I want to talk a little bit about her life and in particular her family. Jane Austen really was singularly fortunate in her parents. As Deirdre LaFay says, George Austen was smart, ambitious, and well-educated. He earned a Bachelor of Arts, Master of Arts, and Bachelor of Divinity degrees at Oxford and was a Fellow of St. John's College. His Austen relatives were close-knit and supportive. His uncle paid for his education, and a distant cousin provided the living of Steventon and others. He married Cassandra, youngest daughter of the Reverend Thomas Lee. Her uncle was Dr. Theophilus Lee, master of Balliol College, a witty and well-known man. These things are not of importance in themselves, but they serve to show that the family from which Jane sprang was on both sides of some consideration. George Austen was serene in temper, devoted to his religion and his family, a good father and a good scholar. Cassandra Lee Austin was of a more positive nature, shrewd and acute, high-minded and determined, with a strong sense of humor and ardently attached to her children. She was proud of her aristocratic Lee ancestors, but did not scorn to supervise her own poultry yard and cows, her dairy. If it is possible to divide qualities which often overlap, it may be thought that Jane Austen inherited from her father her serenity of mind, the refinement of her intellect, her delicate appreciation of style. From her mother, she inherited an acute observation of character and the wit and humor for which she was equally distinguished. Talk a little bit about the background of Reverend Austen and Miss Lee. George Austen was born in 1731 and he died in 1805. On the 26th of April, 1764, George Austen married by special license Cassandra Lee at St. Swithin's Walcott in Bath. His marriage settlement was some freehold lands in Tonbridge and a third of properties held by his stepmother. In December 1800, after 35 years ministering in Steventon, George Austen renounced his retirement and moved to Bath, where he spent his final years. He died on the 21st of January, 1805, is buried at St. Swithin's Church, where there is a memorial to him. And JASNA Churches Committee did pay to have his headstone refurbished a few years ago. Cassandra Lee Austin was born in 1739 and she died in 1827. She was the daughter of Reverend Thomas Lee and Jane Lee of Harpsden, Oxfordshire. Her dowry consisted of some leasehold houses in Oxford and £1,000 from her father's will. She was a wife, mistress of the household, and in charge of children and servants. She had a reputation for running an economical household, but she was also witty and lively. She gave birth to 8 children, all of whom survived, something for a miracle of those times. And I know we've had other speakers talk about childbirth and childhood. But the Austens didn't have all the markings of gentry. Mr. Austen had no private income aside from the small inheritance of land. He received interest on it. He was educated at Oxford and ordained in the Church of England. He was given a living by a relative, which meant he served as the pastor of the parish of Steventon and later received the living of dean from another relative. In addition to his ties from his parishioners, he also farmed the Glebe farm, and he also ran a boarding school for young boys, and they would stay from months to years. Although Jane Austen writes about the landed gentry, she was not one of them, says Edward Copeland. The fringes of gentry were those holding kinship to the landed gentry while dependent on earned income from a male breadwinner. This group was less insulated from economic turmoil. And in Jane Austen's own lifetime, the British economy experienced a series of economic crises. An oversized national debt, often brought about by the constant war, 4 waves of serious recession, 2 banking crises, one of which we know Henry's bank failed, the debasement of coins, a major economic crash and depression led in combination to a doubling of consumer prices. And at least in Steventon, in the early days, the Austens could grow their own food. So there are 8 children and a lot of scholars living in the household at Steventon. As Jan Vergas has observed, Jane Austen is unique and her family must be too. But the particular quality of happiness in the large, lively, healthy, intelligent Austen family may surprise modern readers. Like Elizabeth Bennet, the Austens seem to have made it their family business to be satisfied, and it was their temper to be happy. Most of them were resilient and united in adversity when it came, affectionate and cheerful in prosperity. No other writer's childhood comes to mind that can bear comparison to Jane Austen's for love, warmth, encouragement, security, and sanity. Modern scholarship reemphasizes the family's wholesomeness, its good nature, and its unique ability to nurture Jane's talent. Jane Austen grew up in the Hampshire countryside, enjoying the liberty of the country, which is a quote from Mansfield Park. She and Cassandra went out in all weather and visited neighbors and family around the area. Austen did not suffer the sort of mental and physical confinement imposed on Victorian little girls. She was actually of the Georgian era. The Austens valued reading, writing, and sparkling conversation, and so the children grew up with a broader worldview than might be expected of a country parson's family. So those of you who love Catherine Moorland, here's a quote from Northanger Abbey. Mrs. Moorland was a very good woman and wished to see her children everything they ought to be. But her time was so much occupied in lying in and teaching the little ones that her elder daughters were inevitably left to shift for themselves. And it was not very wonderful that Catherine, who had by nature nothing heroic about her, should prefer cricket, baseball, riding on horseback, and running about the country at the age of 14 to books, or at least books of information. For providing that nothing like useful knowledge could be gained from them, provided they were all story and no reflection, she had no objection to books at all. But from 15 to 17, she was in training for a heroine. She read all such works as heroines must read to supply their memories with those quotations, which are so serviceable and so soothing in the vicissitudes of their eventful lives. I love that. That's one of my favorites. So are we seeing Jane Austen and Catherine Moorland? So one of the things that's really interesting to me about the children's formal education is how extremely different the boys' schooling versus the girls' schooling. Most of the children at that time would have been taught their letters and their numbers by their mother, Mrs. Austen. The boys obviously had much more formal education once they were able to read and write based on their father, but also going on to school. Jane and her sister Cassandra attended schools together with their cousin Jane Cooper, but for a total of less than 2 years. Most of their education was undertaken privately at home, and we don't know, but we believe that the girls also would have been taught by their father, not to the extent that the boys were, but at least a grounding in basic education. They also had access to their father's library, which, as you know, was quite large for its time and was dispersed on his retirement to Bath. At the Abbey House, the curriculum included writing, spelling, French, history, geography, needlework, drawing, music, and dancing. Jane also had some Italian. While 2 of her brothers would go on to take degrees at Oxford University, and another would complete his education with the 4-year Grand Tour of Europe, Jane Austen and her sister, like all other women of the time, even those of their social background, the gentry and the middle classes, had little formal education, no admittance to university or to a career, and no opportunity for independent travel. So there's a very basic differential in educating boys and girls. During Jane Austen's lifetime, the limited nature of women's opportunities to learn was the subject of lively debate. Writers with otherwise opposing political views, like Catherine Macaulay, Mary Wollstonecraft, Anna Letitia Barbauld, Esther Chapone, and Hannah More, were united in their condemnation of the narrow limits of female education. In Letters on Education, 1790, the radical Macaulay advised parents, quote, "Confine not the education of your daughters to what is regarded as the ornamental parts of it," end quote. By ornamental parts, she meant drawing, music, a smattering of French and Italian, just enough to attract a husband, but not intimidate him, and to offer some refuge from boredom in leisure hours. But equally, the more conservative Chapone argued for a disciplined and regulated course of reading that went deeper than mere fashion and accomplishment. And she wrote, "The principal study I would recommend is history. I know of nothing equally proper to entertain and improve at the same time, and that so as likely to form and strengthen your judgment." Mrs. Austen would have taught Cassandra and Jane how to manage a household, care for the illnesses and injuries of the family, act politely in society, care for the poor in their community, and live on a limited income while being a gracious and welcoming neighbor and friend. All of Jane Austen's novels engage with the debate over women's education by exploring the intellectual and moral distance between the show of mere accomplishments and the deeper understanding that signals self-knowledge. Often the distance between show and substance is what separates her heroines from other women in their society. For Austen, one route to such inward knowledge is reading. Austen's representation of her heroines shows that she believed that women possessed both intelligence and moral capacity, and that it was important to develop both of these facilities through proper education. Most of her heroines are deficient in traditional accomplishments. Indeed, Cassandra only drew, and Jane herself only played the piano. But in each story, the improvement of the mind and character of the heroine is an essential part of the main line of the action. The stories imply that self-awareness, rationality, and moral excellence are the result of observation and experience, plus thoughtful reflection. There's lots that could be said about women's education at the time. So the Austen boys and their profession. Though she lived a quiet life, Jane Austen had unusual access to the greater world, primarily through her brothers. Eldest brother James was considered the writer of the family, writing verse, poetry, plays, and critical articles from an early age. He was fond of country pursuits and once rode to hounds with the Prince of Wales. He was ordained and took over his father's livings as rector of Steventon and other places. Henry, who eventually became a clergyman like his father and his brother James, was an officer in the militia and later a banker. Austen visited Henry in London, where she attended the theater, art exhibitions, and social events, and also corrected proofs of her novels. I'm sure most of you have seen these photos in the silhouette. On the left, her brother Edward was adopted by wealthy cousins, the Knights, becoming their heir and later taking their name. His grand tour of Europe lasted 4 years, including a year in Dresden at the university. On extended visits to Godmersham, Edward's estate in Kent, Jane and Cassandra took part in the privileged life of the landed gentry, which was reflected in all of her fiction. And on the right-hand side, we have Francis, also known as Frank or Fly, and Charles. They were officers in the Royal Navy, served on ships around the world, and saw action in the Napoleonic Wars, including the War of 1812 in North America. Frank was one of Admiral Nelson's captains of Trafalgar, eventually becoming Admiral of the Fleet, the highest ranking officer in the Navy, in 1863. Charles commanded the British expedition during the Second Anglo-Burmese War, but died of cholera at Prüm on 7 October 1852 at the age of 73. So her brothers were very well traveled. And remember, this is a close-knit family, always writing letters back and forth. So what did the girls do all day? At home and with their brothers, they were responsible for some of the housekeeping management and light cooking, sewing, mending, cutting patterns, making clothes, shopping for food and sundries, helping the poor, providing for those in need, such as laying in, death, setting up with the family, those sorts of things. They also maintained extensive correspondence with their family, their friends, their neighbors, their business relations. And super important for Jane Austen and Cassandra, they provided childcare for their dozens of nieces and nephews. Don't believe me, look up the family tree. There's dozens of them. One of the things that we tend to forget, or maybe never even think about, is the sheer volume of work that had to be done at home to take care of everyday things, one of which was sewing. Women of this time, regardless of rank, spent a tremendous amount of time sewing. There was embroidery and fancy work, but they also did things like making and mending clothes, household linens, all sorts of things, because clothes were not yet ready-made. Seamstresses could be hired to make clothes, but most women knew how to, and in fact did, remake their own clothes. And one of the things that's always in the letters, those of you who have access to read the letters, is how much Jane Austen lets Cassandra know what she's doing with her hats and her sleeves and her, gowns, turning her gowns, all that sort of thing. Huge amounts of work. The other thing is fancy sewing, and some of you have seen the needle cases and some of the things that Jane Austen made as well. Something that we tend to forget is the sisters would have been responsible for sewing their brothers' shirts and clothing before they were married, at which point their wives would take over. On September 1796, Jane Austen wrote to her sister Cassandra from their brother Edward's house. "We are very busy making Edward shirts, and I'm proud to say that I'm the neatest worker of the party." So all of this was done by hand. And one of the things that's of note is the shirts, the cravats, those sorts of things were very simple design-wise, because they were most economical to cut in blocky shapes. Even philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft conceded that for a woman to make clothes for her family was, quote, her duty. This is her part of the family business, unquote. Jane Austen also made shirts for her brothers who were in the Navy, and she wrote on the 1st of November, 1800, "I have heard from Charles and am to send him his shirts by half dozens as they are finished. One set will go next week." So Charles was going to get dozens of shirts, and he was going to be at sea for a long time. So he needed all that linen, cravats, handkerchiefs, all that stuff had to be made by the sisters. So, as I mentioned before, Reverend Austen retired in 1800. The Austen parents and the, quote, girls, that's what their parents referred to them as, girls, moved to Bath, where there were many social and family activities. It seems that Jane was far too busy to write consistently on her novels, yet she must have been collecting characters in scenes and dialogue. The parents and sisters also spent time at various seaside resorts, including Lyme Regis. And on one of these holiday visits, Jane Austen may have had a romance that can only remain nameless and dateless. Whatever happened, the gentleman's name, his regard for Jane, and hers in return, only Cassandra knew in later years, and she never revealed the details to anyone. With the Reverend George Austen's death in 1805, Mrs. Austen and her daughters had to reduce their lifestyle to suit their smaller income. The living at Steventon and the other livings were given over to Reverend James Austen. Mrs. Austen had a small dowered income, and her sons each pledged a sum of money per year to support her and their sisters. Cassandra had a small inheritance from her late fiancé, and both Cassandra and Jane had received £50 as a legacy from a family friend. One result of this more economical lifestyle was living together with other family members, such as Frank's family or Charles's family, and traveling to visit kinfolk where they might stay for several weeks or months. There were long trips to help care for Edward's 11 children at Godmersham, usually one sister going at a time so that Mrs. Austen was not left alone. Jane Austen continued writing letters and some novel manuscripts, such as the Watsons, but was not producing the quality or the quantity that she had during her younger years at Steventon. Now we go to Chawton, and I know many of you have been to Chawton. Jane lived what is now Jane Austen House Museum in Chawton for the last 8 years of her life. She moved here in 1809 with her mother, sister Cassandra, and friend Martha Lloyd after a period spent living in lodgings. The cottage was owned by Jane's brothers Edward, who inherited the Chawton estate from the Knights. The 17th century building was offered to the women rent-free for life. On Cassandra's death in 1845, it was subdivided for laborers' housing. It was at Chawton that Jane's genius flourished and where she wrote, revised, and had published all her major works: Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, Emma, Northanger Abbey, and Persuasion. This home provided the stability, the routine, and the space for Jane to write, just as the family home in Steventon had given her in her youth. The women still traveled to see family, but family increasingly traveled to visit and stay with them at Chawton Cottage. Several of the nephews attending Winchester College often stopped by on their way to and from school. The Naval brothers and their families came, sometimes to live nearby or for extended visits. And if you've been at Chawton Cottage, you know it's not a big house. So it must have been full all the time. James often rode over from Steventon, only 10 or 11 miles by countryside, sometimes daily. In December 1816, Henry became an ordained deacon and was appointed curate of Chawton, where he was well respected as an evangelical preacher. Edward's family came to stay at their estate, Chawton House, but most of the time Jane lived at the cottage. Chawton House was leased to another family. And I know many of you have been to Chawton House as well. Mrs. Austen relinquished the management of the household, which Cassandra and Martha Lloyd assumed. While Mrs. Austen gardened, Jane had light duties such as breakfast, and she wrote. I'm very grateful for Cassandra and Martha Lloyd. Jan Fergus notes, one senses a return of Jane Austen's literary energy, of purpose, of family harmony and security, particularly as recorded in Jane's poetical letter to Frank in July 1809. Cassandra's pen will paint our state, the many comforts that await, our Chawton home, how much we find already in it to our mind, and how convinced that when complete, it will all other houses beat, that ever have been made or mended, with rooms concise or rooms distended. You'll find us very snug next year, perhaps with Charles and Fanny near. For now it often does delight us to fancy them just o'erwrite us. Not too poetical. I want to point out the picture of the dining room. That is the new wallpaper. That is a replica of what was there in Jane Austen's time. Also in the top right, you will see a picture of the patchwork quilt that the Austen ladies had done earlier. In the summer of 1817, Jane Austen left Chawton Cottage to seek advanced medical care in Winchester, and she died there on July 18th, 1817. Cassandra wrote to their niece Fanny about Jane's death. I have lost a treasure, such a sister, such a friend as never have been surpassed. She was the sun of my life, the gilder of every pleasure, the soother of every sorrow. I had not a thought concealed from her, and it is as if I had lost a part of myself. I loved her only too well, not better than she deserved, but I am conscious that my affection for her made me sometimes unjust to and negligent of others. And I can acknowledge, more than as a general principle, that justice of the hand which has struck this blow. You know me too well to be at all afraid that I should suffer materially from my feelings. I am perfectly conscious of the extent of my irreparable loss, but I am not at all o'erpowered and am very little indisposed. Nothing but what a short time, with rest and change of air, will remove. I thank God that I was enabled to attend her to the last, and amongst my many causes of self-reproach, I have not to add any willful neglect of her comfort. And that's the house there in Winchester. Some of you may have been in it. Right now, it's a private home. So Jane Austen didn't travel very far. Her world was really circumscribed. And I think one of the things that's really astonishing is that she may have written as many as 3,000 letters, but only some 160 survive. So many of the letters were written to Cassandra, and in 1843, she burned the greater part of them and cut pieces out of those that she kept. And she did that to spare the feelings of family members. And that is something that, of course, we all regret, but that's what was done. The paucity of the record leaves modern biographers little with which to work. So there's a lot of supposition, inference, all that sort of thing. The situation was compounded as successive generations of the family expunged and sanitized the already opaque details of her biography. The heirs of Jane's brother, Admiral Francis Austen, destroyed more letters en masse. Details were excised from the biographical notice her brother Henry wrote in 1818, and family details continued to be omitted or embellished in her nephew James Edward Austen Lee's memoir of Jane Austen, published in 1869. And in William and Richard Arthur Austen Lee's biography, Jane Austen, Her Life and Letters, published in 1913. The legend the family and relatives created reflects their biases in favor of good, quiet Aunt Jane and reflects their Victorian biases. So that's what we had left coming forward. So why do people still read Jane Austen, and how did this come to be? She was an ordinary person, and she wrote 6 novels and some other miscellaneous stuff. So how did this legacy came to be? And there's tons of great quotes. One that I like is, once I started writing the screenplay of Bride and Prejudice, I was convinced Jane Austen was a Punjabi in her previous birth. So I think she's universal. Of course, and there's Virginia Woolf. Of all great writers, she is the most difficult to catch in the act of greatness. So I think it's her style and her absolutely human characters. But other writers have written great things. And somehow or another, she has persisted all these years. So who was her competition that were even more famous in their time when Jane Austen was alive? And here are some authors, even Walter Scott, talking about the first poetess of romantic fiction, Anna Letitia Barbald, talking about a genius of no uncommon stamp, Thomas de Quincey, that great enchantress of the generation. Who is the most popular writer of all time? Mrs. Radcliffe. I know you all are probably thinking you could barely get through Mysteries of Udolpho, but it was important. Anne Ward Radcliffe lived from 1764 to 1823, basically the reign of George III. Although Radcliffe wrote poetry, a travelogue, and 3 other novels, her literary reputation today rests largely on the 3 Gothic romances she published during the 1790s, which, as you know, was when Jane Austen wrote Northanger Abbey. So The Romance of the Forest, which I'm not sure if anybody has read, interspersed with some pieces of poetry, that was in 1791. The Mysteries of Udolpho, a romance, interspersed with some pieces of poetry, written in 1794. and The Italian or the Confessional of the Black Penitents, written in 1796, published in early 1797. So this was the top selling author in the 1790s when Jane Austen did write Northanger Abbey, and some of these pieces, some of these novels are actually mentioned in the book. Radcliffe became the most highly paid professional writer in the 1790s, bar none. The average amount earned by an author upon receipt of a manuscript was £10. Her publishers bought the copyright for The Mysteries of Udolpho for £500, and The Italian earned her a staggering £800. So she was making money. Many of you know that Jane Austen's father sold her manuscript, then called Susan, for £10 in 1803, and it was not published. Her brother bought it back in 1816, and as we know, it was not published until after her death. Even though it was written in 1790s, it was not published until quite a bit later. But make no mistake, Jane Austen wrote for the money. Here's a quote from a letter. People are more ready to borrow in praise than to buy, which I cannot wonder at. But though I like praise as well as anybody, I like what Edward calls pewter too. Reverend George Austen's best year of income was probably right before he retired in 1800, with an estimate of £600 to £700. So Jane Austen was writing to an audience. She was writing for money, and really is a product of her time. She read authors like Henry Fielding, Jonathan Swift, Samuel Richardson, Fanny Burney, Maria Edgeworth. She jokingly considered the poet and novelist Sir Walter Scott a rival. She did enjoy family theatricals, read plays by Richard Brinsley Sheridan, and she also enjoyed William Cowper's poetry and not Byron as much. We all know how she feels about Byron. So one of the things that sets Jane Austen apart is how she's dealing with her characters, their situations, and what's happening. As Henry Mantell says, quote, I love Jane Austen because she's so shrewdly practical. You can hear the chink of cash in every paragraph, end quote. So this is a chart from The Guardian a few years ago, talking about what people were worth, how much money they had. And you'll see way down there at the bottom is Jane Austen with £450. So not terribly well-to-do. Mrs. Norris has £600 a year. And Jane Austen's would have been accumulated from both her father's legacy as well as the brothers chipping in to pay for the sisters and their mother's expenses. I love this graph. I think it's wonderful. There's Mr. Rushworth, poor Mr. Rushworth, with his £12,000 and not a brain cell in his box. So, and Henry Crawford actually has £4,000. So he's pretty well to do. I love this graph. So how come Jane Austen is a cult now? And an entire industry. And she's been in the industry now for going on 220 some odd years. She wrote realistic novels in that people had real life situations. They had to deal with things that were going on in their lives, not romances or didactical novels, those sorts of things. Many of you have read Mariah Edgeworth. Some of you may have read Charlotte Smith's novels. The Minerva Press novels also get slammed a lot because they're very silly and very romantical. But one of the things that happened was people began to read more, and there was a demand for good literature. And one of the things that Devoney Lusser and Janine Barkis also talk about is schooling. Schools needed literature for people to read, and Austen was one of the classics. Whereas the school wouldn't want to have the Minerva Press novels for their pupils, Jane Austen was acceptable. And it also started in the 1890s when highbrow critics began to celebrate her as a literary stylist. And then in World War I and II, free, cheap pocket editions were sent to the front. And I think many of you have heard the comment before that in 1939, when Pride and Prejudice came out with Laurence Olivier and Greer Garson, they reissued paperback editions that sold over 1 million copies in a year. These are cheap, like 10 pence or something. It was really cheap editions. So not only were people looking at the movies, they were buying the books. And we can't forget Colin Firth and Jennifer Earle and Andrew Davies, whom we all adore, in 1995 Masterpiece Theater, Pride and Prejudice. And now it's also Sanditon, and dare I even say Bridgerton. So we have these very attractive people doing, well, sort of, mostly by the book, but also the appeal of these timeless stories. So I think that's something that bolsters Jane Austen's appeal. This is another chart from The Guardian. Of course, it's several years old now, but people are very interested in her as a person, in addition to her output as an author. So I think it's fascinating that so much of what we consider important to know about was not important in her own lifetime. So this is readily available on the internet if you're interested. So one of the enduring mysteries of her cult and legacy is her ledger stone at Winchester Cathedral. She's now celebrated as one of England's greatest novelists, greatest writers, but when she was buried in the cathedral in 1817, her original ledger stone made no mention of her books, and she was not known at all to the general public. Her brother Henry Austen probably wrote the inscription. One of the enduring mysteries is how and why she came to have such a significant and expensive burial, including this magnificent stone. And many of you have been there and laid flowers on the stone. The Austen brothers, particularly Henry and James, must have worked hard to obtain permission for the burial spot, and all of them must have contributed substantial funding to cover the estimated £250 for her burial and the stone. And of course, you all know what the stone says, or have read the stone, been there. So I won't repeat it, but the plaque, the brass plaque was erected in 1872. And as you also know, she is in Westminster Abbey in the Poets' Corner. So getting her due a little bit late, but nonetheless. So why is Jane Austen trending 200 years after she died? As John Mullen, and many of you enjoy his lectures and his books, there is absolutely no reason for her to become famous, except from the fact she was a genius. Often readers in other countries, especially non-Anglophone countries outside of Europe and the US, think they understand her books better than we do. The interesting thing is that although there are lots of social conventions underlying her stories, Austen makes those completely understandable to the reader of the novel. And she's only interested in the psychology, not the image. So that translates through time much better than the romances and the crazy situations that Mrs. Radcliffe's characters get into. Thank you so much for joining me today. And I want to say thank you to Jane Bolts and the team at JASNA Southwest for including me today. Do we have questions?
Oh, that was wonderful. Wait a second, Will. Why don't you, you can stop sharing your screen or you can leave that on, huh? Well, thank you so much, Vicki. That was a wonderful presentation. I have one question before I hand the Q&A off to Leah Hoyata,
Yeah.
our secretary. That question is, you are a professional fundraiser.
Right.
I want to ask you about philanthropy in the Regency era.
Yes. There was philanthropy. Many of you have heard of the Foundling Hospital that Thomas Coram founded and that Handel endowed with the Messiah composition. There wasn't a social network or a social safety net. Some of the taxes were mandatory, particularly parish poor rates, which provided workhouses for the indigent and the destitute. Most people would rather die than go to one of those, but that was a form of philanthropy. Oftentimes in the neighborhood area, philanthropy was more of a personal, as when Mr. Knightley brings a ham and baked apples to Miss Bates and Mrs. Bates. But philanthropy as an institution did exist. It just was in the beginning stages. So there wasn't the concept that people needed to provide for others. They were to provide for themselves unless they were seriously handicapped, indigent, on their last legs. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, very good. Yeah. I'm going to ask David if he has received any questions in the chat, because there was a direct message to you. David?
To me?
No? If you have you received any questions? Otherwise, I'm going to hand it over to Leah.
No, you hand over to Leah. Yeah.
Okay,
I didn't
Leah.
see any questions.
Okay, Leah, can you unmute yourself? And Leah will do the Q&A.
Hello, I'm Leah, I'm the secretary, and I see we have one hand up for a question. I have also in chat a general, like if you have a question, please put question in front. So that way people that are more visual can see the question. And I'll try to do it in order of how I receive them. So let's see, first question. What is DACA spelling cotton? You mentioned that there will be a future talk about it, so I'm curious about it. What does it look like? Can we buy this kind of cotton now? If so, how much? Sorry for so many questions.
Well, Jane told me that we're going to have a speaker going to talk about DACA cotton, but in the olden days, before the spinning mills in the British Midlands, cotton was woven by hand in India, and it was extremely fine. And obviously there's grades of cotton cloth, but Dhaka cotton was extremely fine. It was hand woven, very, very expensive, and not able to be replicated to this day. So once the British industry decimated the Indian cotton textile industry, Dhaka cotton went away. There are examples in collections, but you can't buy it today. And I know that the speaker coming up, and Jane can correct me, but they will talk about that. It was whisper thin, incredibly beautiful, but it didn't survive Britain taking over the textile industry. And many of you know that Germany also had a huge textile industry, and their cotton was, of course, just like Britain's, all imported from places heavily dependent on slave labor.
I'll just add to that. Yes, on, let's see, this is going to be on November 12th. We're going to have a Zoom presentation by a Mr. Saiful Islam, he leads a project to resurrect this precious fabric, which was imported from what was then Bengal, is now Bangladesh, and popularized in the late 18th century. So he's going to talk on history and restoration of the lost art of the Dhaka muslin. So look for that, November 12th. That's a Zoom presentation.
Thanks, Jane.
Okay, next question. I'm going to go back and forth between the ones that I had privately sent to me and the ones that are in chat. So in chat, aside from Northanger Abbey, oh, sorry, actually there's a few more beforehand. Okay, sorry. So one of the older questions, in what order should a Jane Austen newbie read her books?
I always start with Northanger Abbey because it's awesome. And that to me is written with the immediacy of a very young teenage Jane Austen. So I love to start, when I encourage people to start, I always start with Northanger Abbey. Partly also because it's funny and there's lots of activity. For most people, I have a hard time recommending Mansfield Park as the first novel they read, so I wouldn't go there. But yes, start with Northanger Abbey, go to Pride and Prejudice or Sense and Sensibility. Emma, I always end with Persuasion because I feel that has that autumnal glow that it's lovely. But you know, a lot of people now have been exposed to Andrew Davies' Sanditon, which is like 99% Andrew Davies and 1% Jane Austen. So however they get into the canon, I don't care.
Thank you. Okay, another question. In regards to fancy sewing, does that mean women brought their sewing projects to parties? Or was fancy sewing only brought to get-togethers where it was more than just family present? So like friends, social gatherings that are less formal than a ball. I'm imagining Jane bringing her best embroidery projects to exhibit in front of extended family and friends in her community.
I think, yeah, at a party at the assembly or, you know, dancing and stuff like that, no. But if they were having tea with neighbors, everyone would have been expected to bring their work. And work was sewing. That they call it work. But for the most part, I think that would be casual, informal, but not a party per se.
Okay, two questions that are pretty much the same. From Linda, do you have any more details on the guy that Jane was engaged to for one day? Did they know each other for a long time? Was there chemistry? Did he marry someone else? And then someone else asked, are there specific surviving letters in regards to the
No.
mystery romance in Lyme Regis, or is it from family oral history that we know of this romance? I'm curious
Right.
about Mystery Man. So two.
So Harris Bigwither was the younger brother of several sisters who were very close to Jane and Cassandra. And they were Althea, and I can't remember the other sister's name. And they lived nearby, and lifelong friends of Jane and Cassandra. And he was their younger brother, Harris. She was in her late 20s, and he, I believe, was 24. And the families were close, and he offered for Jane, and she accepted. And during the night, when she and Cassandra were staying with the family, she was in turmoil, and she declined the next morning, and they sent an express off to James, brother James, to come and get them. It was very awkward. They were there. Obviously, they had no transportation of their own. And James came and got them and brought them home. But the relationship with the sisters was not substantially impaired. In fact, it was Althea and her sister, whose married name I forget right this minute, who arranged for the house where Jane Cassandra stayed in Winchester. So they were very close up until the end. And unfortunately, Harris, unfortunately for him, very fortunate for us, because if she had married, I doubt she would have been writing. But he did marry and have his own family. The gentleman, the mystery gentleman, that went to Cassandra with her in her grave. Nobody knows anything about that. It's simply a story that was handed down from the family. So we don't know anything else. And so that's always been a tantalizing clue that maybe there was a gentleman. Many of you know Kipling's poem about the gentleman waiting for her in heaven. It's a lovely poem, but again, it's made up out of whole cloth. There's no substantiation for it. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Okay, another question. Aside from Northanger Abbey, in which of her other novel characters do you detect elements of Jane, as you noted in Kathleen Moorland?
Oh, Lizzie Bennet. Let me tell you, friends, I think that sharp and witty, the zingers to Lady Catherine, I detect Jane in that. I also think that she is not pinning portraits of people, but she's taking people that we would all know, like Miss Bates, like Harriet Smith, Emma. All those people are containing parts of her. But in my mind, I like to think of her as being partly a model for Elizabeth Bennet. I'm sure there's others who would say something about other characters, but in my mind, it's definitely Catherine Moorland and part of Lizzie Bennet.
Okay, so this is from Cartmania. It's more of a comment, but there might be some questions related to it. Just want to mention regarding Jane's burial at Winchester Cathedral, mystery is also compounded by the fact that she actually died in the parish of the small church across the street from the cathedral. Under normal circumstances, her burial would have been there. Do you have any comments or questions about that?
This is something that's only recently become quite a mystery that people are interested in. One, she is in a very prominent spot in Winchester Cathedral. She didn't get taken back to Chawton. She wasn't buried in a parish somewhere. She's buried in the cathedral, and it cost a fortune And it wasn't like anybody could just sign up and be buried in the cathedral. So there was a lot of behind the scenes work done to get her there. We have to assume that James and Henry, who were ordained and would have had some kind of a relationship with the bishop, would have been the ones to make that happen. So it is a mystery. It cost a lot of money to bury their spinster sister in this highly prestigious place with this amazing ledger stone. So I'm sure the brothers all had to chip in, but it's a mystery.
Okay, I know we have 5 more minutes left, so I'm going to try to get as much as I can. And I apologize for anyone who had more questions towards the end, but we're running out of time. Question, aside from, question, do we know how Jane progressed on her novels? Did she outline? Did she just start at the beginning and progress to the end, or jump around? Did her sisters or brothers ever critique her work and give suggestions?
I can answer the last part for sure. Yes. When she was writing, she would write things and read them to her family members for critique, approval, just how did it flow, that kind of a thing. Her letters do talk about that. As far as her actual writing, I don't know that we know exactly how it was done. The earliest novels were epistolatory, so they were written as letters to and from the various characters. So that would have been a very natural style, because everybody wrote letters in her family. And that was a common device for novel writing. As she progressed, Sense and Sensibility originally started as an epistolatory novel, but was changed later to the novel that we know now. But I don't know that anybody knows exactly how she thought it out. I'd be curious myself.
Another question, is there a quick calculator of what Jane Austen earned in modern times? I'm thinking how low it is that a servant's annual salary of 20 pounds. I feel like I go through $20 so quickly. How much can someone live on during the Regency era on just 20 pounds?
Not much. There are calculators. I don't know that they have a tremendous amount of value. There's loads of them that you could use on the internet. And several speakers have talked about, that. I think John Mullen actually had an article about it once. And in Persuasions, there are several articles that go back, which you can search online on the website. But 800 pounds or 700 pounds in Jane Austen's lifetime would have enabled a family to have a carriage and horses, a coachman, all that sort of business. So that was definitely, putting on the Ritz. Most people couldn't afford that. So they're looking at a substantially reduced annual income. But even Mrs. Austen, in her widowhood, still had a maid of all work and a man to do the wood chopping and all that sort of thing, stoking the fires, all that sort of thing. So even though they lived on very little, they were able to afford servants because things are expensive and people were cheap. So a maid at 20 pounds a year, she would have been provided her clothing, her food, her board, and anything she needed beyond food, clothing, and housing would have been on her own. So people are cheap, easier to replace. Does that answer your question? Does that help?
Thank you. And unfortunately, the time is 12:29, so I don't think we can get to the last 2 questions. Vicki or Jane, do you have anything else to wrap up?
No, I just want to say thank you, Vicki. That was a wonderful presentation and I loved everything about it and all your visuals and your answers. Great Q&A. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Very good.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And we'll see you next time.
Okay,
Bye.